For Climate Week last year, we had climate experts explaining the climate science and the consequences. I'm not going to talk about climate science. I'm not a climate scientist. But what I do want to talk about is one of the consequences of the reaction we should be taking to the risks of climate change, and talking about aviation. Now, if you're interested in sustainability, aviation always pops out as the sore thumb, as the problem, because it's expanding rapidly, and the emissions coming off it, we have no plans to control those emissions. And so our own Sustainable Development Commission, when the government set it up, it's now gone in the bonfire of the Quangos, but the Sustainable Development Commission first project was to look at aviation. And when they looked at aviation, they found a very polarized debate, because there were environmentalists saying, this is bad for the environment, I don't fly, neither should you. And then there was the other side of the debate, which was a larger group of people supporting aviation's role in the economy and the fact that flying away on holiday cheaply is really good. And so this polarized debate, I thought, well, I like challenges. And so the Sustainable Development Commission delivered their report and then backed off because it's too difficult. So I thought I'd approach that a couple of years ago to research, can aviation be more sustainable, and see what I come up with. And actually I've come up with what I think is a very optimistic outlook for aviation, but it's different, and therefore it's going to be resisted. So just to sort of kick off with, if I ask a couple of questions of you, and please do join in, have we got anybody that chooses not to fly because they're worried about the environmental consequences? All right, a couple of people who take that view. Those people that do fly, which is most of you, do you ever buy an offset to mitigate the impact? Buy a carbon offset? Yes? How many hands? Quite a few, 3, yeah. That's probably more than an average audience would have. What if aviation was more expensive? Who would object to that? Ooh, we're not sure about that. Yes, yes, people do object to that. What if we could have low carbon green aviation, which it cost a bit more and it was different, but it was possible? Would people like to see that? All right, well, let's just see when I walk through this as to where this takes us.
Can you have your cake and eat?
Exactly, that's what we'd like to be able to do. We'd like to fly, but it should be low carbon flying. Flying is expanding quite rapidly, and so if I give you some figures, the global emissions from aviation, 2 to 3%. Now, some people would say that's too much and we need to reduce it. Other people say, well, it's only 2 or 3%. Why bother? We could insulate our buildings better, we could drive more efficient cars. There's easier ways of saving carbon, so let's leave aviation alone. And that tends to be what has gone on. Just give some figures from 2010, which is the most recent figures I've got. 5 billion people flew in 2010, and 90 million tons of air freight were travelled. Now, that's quite a bit of travelling, but if you ask the International Air Transport Association, their vision for 2050, what they think is going to happen is that 5 billion people flying will rise to 16 billion. 90 million tons of air freight is going to rise to 400 million tons of air freight. So that's a big expansion. And we don't have any plans to control the emissions that come from that, because it's been left outside Kyoto. It's been left outside the arrangements. It's been left for aviation to come up with its own proposals. And if we look at the emissions that will come from that expansion, is that industry estimates around 2.5 times current emissions by 2050. Other commentators, it depends which researchers you talk to, perhaps it's 4 times, perhaps it's more. So we have a huge expansion and no plan to call a limit to that. This is one of my favorite cartoons where at a climate conference the presenter is trying to say, look, for climate change is an issue, we need to do some things. We need to be more independent for our energy supplies. We need to preserve the rainforests. We need to live more sustainably. A whole range of things we need to do. And of course the barracker is saying, well, but what if it's a hoax? Why are we creating a better world for nothing? Which is, it's madness. But I'm going to put aviation into the category of the slide to say low carbon green aviation is something we should want to do in any case, regardless of whether climate change is a severe crisis or not. It's something we should do. Now, climate change, though, might be, if we see it as a crisis, would force us to do it. Now, I'm going to borrow something from Sir Brian Hosking, who said that what we need is a very short, sharp climate event which is severe and makes us act and stays long enough for us to take action and then goes away again and then abates gently. I think that's right, Brian, isn't it? So, so we had in Pangbourne, we had 4 or 5 years ago, we had the big flood. Now, if extreme weather events become common, and so it's hitting people directly, and it's shown to be as a result of climate change, then maybe we'll have the situation where we say, actually, this is a crisis. I know the scientists have been saying that for some time, but if the general public, if we all start saying, yes, it's a crisis, then we can do something about it. And let me dip back in history a bit. This is about aviation, so I'm going to show a few pictures of aircraft. This is the Spitfire Supermarine. And if you think back to the Second World War, that was a crisis. And we have in aviation, after the First World War, aviation really got going. After the Second World War, lots of old airframes from the war were left over, and it got the airlines running. So the crises of the wars have been really good for aviation. And I'm going to suggest that the crisis of climate change can be good for aviation again, and it can launch a golden age once we see it as a crisis. And if I share a little story that I found from my research, close to here, Greenham Common, in 1941, March 1941, they decided they should have an airfield at Greenham Common. And the Cookham Golf Club was closed down before the end of that year. And the airfield was ready to operate in summer 1942, so just over a year later. Now that's a crisis response. It shows you what you can do when there's a real crisis. Now, what are we doing? This is taken from last week, when it's our minister, I'm told there is a Minister of Energy and Tourism, and this is him. I didn't know that such exists, but that's what it said against the photo. And he's visiting White Hills. It's a wind farm on Anglesome Moor, close to Glasgow. Now, it's a showpiece renewable energy project. It's a huge tourist attraction now. People like to visit it. It's a big attraction in Scotland. It can power 180,000 homes, very close to a city that needs the power. So in every sense, this is a really good renewable energy project. It took the permission to get this going 10 years. Now, just to connect with the Greenham Common, is I also found out that when Greenham Common was ready to go, there was 120 aircraft from America flew over in hops across the North Atlantic, and it stopped at Prestwick Airport, just close to here, before coming on to Greenham Common. Now, if Greenham Common had been a 21st century renewable energy project, they would have finished fighting the war twice through before the airfield was ready for the planes. So the comparison between our reaction to climate change and what you could do in a crisis is just hugely different. Now, if we just look at what we've got now within aviation now, Ryanair claim to be the greenest airline in Europe. Now, there's a few people saying that's strange. They've got independent research that shows that that is so. It is true. Ryanair don't fly with full planes. They don't have spare seats on their planes. Their load factor is the highest of all the airlines. And so that translates to the carbon emitted per passenger is the best of all the European airlines. That's an amazing fact. But let's look at that in a bit more detail, because the growth of the low-cost airlines is a problem for us. Michael O'Leary went out to Texas, to Southwest Airlines, to Herb Keller, who was the driving force behind Southwest Airlines. And Southwest Airlines realized if you keep it simple and you undercut the bus ride for the same journey, so very cheap seats, and you keep the planes flying with a fast turnaround, so you don't have them sat on the ground, they're flying all the time, is you can make money from it. And this was the beginning of the low-cost airlines. And Ryanair, of course, have taken this to to an art form. What Ryanair do is they're very tough negotiators. They approach a second-string city with a small airport and they set up a new route. And the city want to have them in because they bring in cash-paying tourists. So they don't have to pay very much, and in fact they get marketing support, which they've got to be careful about European rules, but there's been accusations from Air France that Ryanair get paid lots of money to provide flights into certain towns and cities. And so Ryanair are expanding enormously on the back of this model of low-cost airlines. And we've all seen that and experienced that. But what it means is that's the model that's being copied in China, in India, and across in the Far East. So this is AirAsia, one of the low-cost operators, expanding very quickly in that region. Also looking to make very cheap flights between Britain and Australia, using Asian aircrew and Asian facilities in the middle. And so this model of the low-cost aviation and huge expansion is going to get bigger and bigger. And what's really interesting about this is if you say there's a demand to fly and you put on capacity to satisfy demand, that would be a kind of normal way of doing it. But what the low-cost operators do is there may be no demand, but they're confident if they put in the capacity, they will persuade people that weren't going to fly or hadn't thought of flying will come and join in. And so you're building capacity. You know, this is in an era of emissions from aviation, building capacity, knowing you can fill it and expand the game. So we have a huge expansion going on. We've, in the West, have set it up, but now it's being rolled out right through globally elsewhere. Now, we haven't had an agreement internationally to control this, but this is, Jim, you might know who this is, it's the Transport Secretary, Lahoud, and he's not a happy man at the moment. And he's not happy because the EU have taken unilateral action. They've decided there's no plan to control emissions from aviation. So we will include aviation in the EU emission trading scheme. And that came into force a short while ago. The Chinese and the Americans are absolutely livid and really saying this is against international rules. Ryanair have put a levy on flight tickets in order to cover the cost, which is 27 pence per ticket. So this is not actually going to cost the airlines very much now. But what's got the airlines very concerned is it could be this is the beginning of taking real action, which is what I'm going to suggest and propose we do. Real action to tax aviation fuel. Let me go on to the stalemate in policy at the heart of aviation. This is the Chicago Conference, Chicago Convention of 1944. And that's when, over a period of 5 to 7 weeks, I think it was, they agreed the Convention of Civil Aviation. That's 68 years ago, and it still rules aviation today. It locks down the rules of aviation. And one of the articles, I'm not going to bore you with too much of the detail, but Article 24 prevents governments from taxing the fuel on board a plane flying into a country. It's not allowed. Now, what that means in effect is that aviation fuel is tax-free and stays tax-free because, think of it, the UK government. It says, we think we should tax aviation fuel, and the government has said this on a few occasions. We think we should. But if they were to, the airlines would plan operations not to fuel in London. And so instead of Heathrow being a hub, they would go to Schiphol or Charles de Gaulle, and we would just be a short hop into the other hubs. And so the UK government is not going to do the own goal of taxing aviation fuel. So this article of the Chicago Convention means that aviation fuel is tax-free. Now, who knew that before, that aviation fuel is tax-free? All right, lots of people. I mean, we pay tax to fill the car. Why do the airlines not pay tax on their fuel? And we'll see the consequences of that are really quite dramatic. So what are the airlines doing? Because they are actually trying to do quite a lot. I'm not pillorying the airlines necessarily. They're doing quite a lot. This is the Dreamliner, Boeing 787 Dreamliner. It's the most efficient large-size passenger plane so far. When it was launched, they took $110 billion of advance orders. It looks like it's going to be a very successful plane, and they've only just now started delivering them. So it's a just coming off the production line. There's other things aviation are doing. For example, looking to get routes flying much more directly, or glide paths which instead of going down in steps according to air traffic control can glide down the efficient glide path. Or on the ground, a jet engine taxiing is very inefficient, so you turn off the jet engine and you have a tug taking the planes around. So there's a number of things they're doing, but they're not enough. And if I share with you the big objective that's been put forward by the International Air Transport Association, is they've said what we'll do is we'll reduce emissions from aviation by 50% by 2050 compared with a 2005 baseline. If you pause and think about that, that sounds pretty good. And they've got some good press from that. But if you examine what they're saying, is they're not saying emissions will be reduced. Emissions will go up by a factor of 2.5 or so. What they're saying is that 80% of those emissions will be from biofuel, and therefore we can take it out of the calculation. Now, the Committee on Climate Change, UK Committee on Climate Change, really challenged that and said, well, perhaps 10% is feasible, but 80% really isn't. And if you think, there's lots of issues here, but biofuel is going to be an enormous demand across the economy as a replacement for fossil fuel. And if you are moving agricultural capacity into biofuel in a hungry world, that's not easy to do, that's not very fair to do. And then if you end up cutting down the Amazon rainforest in order to grow enough of the feedstock to make the biofuel, it all just doesn't add up. So what aviation are talking about is completely disingenuous. It's kind of correct and accurate in a sense, but it really isn't enough. Let me drop back in history again as well. This is a Russian plane, a Tupolev Tu-114, I think it is, but the propellers rotated in opposite directions. And this allows you to fly very fast with a propeller aircraft, if it's configured like that. And they were building these in 1955, so it's quite an old aircraft. Some of the figures for this aircraft, 550 miles an hour, it's still a world record holder for a propeller airliner. Range of 7,000 miles, and it was a hugely reliable plane. These have one of the best safety records that there were. But what was going on at the same time as these planes were flying? Well, Britain was leading the way by building the Comet. I'm not going to give you a picture of the Comet. It doesn't really deserve to have a picture because it was an unreliable, unsafe, very thirsty jetliner. But where it has its place in history is it is the reference point for every comparison of jet aircraft now is with the Comet. And we say how much more better they are than they were then at the early days. But research has been carried out compared with the propeller aircraft of the 50s, which were only marginally slower than the jets, and it's only the very newest models being produced now that exceed the fuel efficiency of those propeller aircraft. And so that makes you pause to think, what have we been doing for 60 years to recover the efficiency of the 1950s? And if we look again at that, this is a 1970s development by General Electric, which is an open rotor jet, which with counter-rotating blades at the back of it. It's a jet rather than regarded as an open rotor jet. They're about 25% more fuel efficient, these things. And in the 70s, there was an oil crisis, and people started to have the dialogue, we need to live without oil. And in that dialogue, they designed this engine. And then oil prices dropped back. 1980s oil was very cheap, so they dropped it. They said, we don't need to do this. Oil is cheap, so forget it. Other companies are also into it. This is Rolls-Royce now with their open rotor jet engine. And these are examples of technologies which could be employed. But because fuel is so very cheap and tax-free, commercially it can't be done. Commercially, they look at it and say the figures don't add up. And so we're holding on to old technology because the price of fuel is too cheap.
There's some public acceptability as well. People do not like to see blades going around. It looks old-fashioned and unsafe. It looks
old-fashioned, yes. The jet, the Comet was the new thing. Well, that old Russian propeller, that was the old thing. So these are actually a bit noisier. So there is an issue here as well, which can be discussed, but I don't think it should be a barrier But absolutely, yes. What I want to do is think a little bit more about how it could be better, because of course that's the way you start to say, well, we can change it because it could be better. And the example I want to start with is slightly unusual, you might think, but this is the major strategic heavy lift for the US Air Force, the C-17. The Congressional Budget Office did a study in 2005, and this is in the public domain, it's not a secret study, and they looked at replacing this fleet with a new set of C-17s or replacing it with something different. And it's these hybrid, ultra-large aircraft. Now, these have not been built yet, but the study assumed it was possible because the engineering is well understood that these can be built, and they are part airship, part plane. And so they did the study, and they did the detailed figures, and they spent a lot of money on it. And for the same investment in fleet of C-17s, in these, they could shift 3 times more freight for the money. And so you think, hey, that sounds like we should be buying these. But these are relatively slow compared with jets, and they fly relatively low. And so if this is heavy, this report was nothing to do with the environment. It was nothing to do with emissions. This was simply strategic defense. And if you're taking your troops into Iraq or Afghanistan, you don't want something that flies low and slow, because not every country is going to agree with you. And so they decided they wouldn't pursue that. They would stick with the C-17 because for strategic defense purposes, they couldn't afford to go to this. Now, if defense aren't going to develop this, who is? And the reason this is interesting is that these craft are efficient in terms of the fuel they burn. Yes, they travel a bit slower, but you could imagine there's space on board for it to be a luxurious journey for the people who can afford to be luxurious, but also a very cheap journey for the people who are cost-conscious. And so premium green and economy green are different new categories that don't exist now, which I suggest would exist, so that in an era of expensive aviation fuel, where you've priced people out of the market, which of course people don't want to be priced out of the market, what happens is you swap time for money. And so your journey becomes a slower journey, and it's a cheap journey. So that's the kind of, you have to get people to accept that it's going to take them more time to do the journey. But that's one component of a better future. Another part of it is that you still have people that need to move around quickly, that want to move around quickly or need to because of their role and their job. This is an artist's impression of what's called a blended wing aircraft. Instead of a fuselage and wings, it's one shape, it's a flying wing. And this technology for stealth aircraft and some of the secret aircraft that have been built, it's well understood that these can be built and these can be made. And if you look at the figures for some of these, just briefly, the lift to drag of a plane built like this compared with a new plane like the Airbus A380, it's about 50% better lift to drag. It's also about 25% lighter, because the sort of monocoque shape means you need less, those are your engineers, Andy, you need less material to make a shape like that and keep it strong. And overall operating parameters about 30% more efficient. So if we have this technology, why don't we build it and deploy it now? And there's an interesting point here, is that the Dreamliner is only now just being delivered. And there's a lot of people are convinced that Boeing have a design like this ready. Boeing deny it, as you might imagine. But if you think about commercially, I understand entirely commercially, you want to sell Dreamliners for about 20 years to get your money back and make a profit on it. And then you would roll out something like this. But of course, if as a society we said, no, we're going to tax aviation fuel, we're going to make fuel expensive, the business case for something like this becomes viable. Quite how the industry would cope with it, it would be terribly difficult for the industry. But we should, I think, understand that technology is available if all of us together say, actually, we want to go to next generation now. Otherwise, 20 years of production, each plane flies for 20 to 30 years. You know, we're not going to have change before the middle of the century. And that's very, very slow. So the summary of what I've found from my research is that this stalemate of the Chicago Convention, making fuel tax-free, is stopping all the business cases for all the technology that would make aviation hugely better. Now, the argument that I want people to get on board is not choose not to fly, or some of the things that people argue to do. Just support the fact. Say, okay, UK government, take a lead in saying we want to rewrite the Chicago Convention, and it would just need a group like, say, the G20, which is small enough to make decisions, to say, we actually now see climate change as a crisis. What can we do? Let's call for a new convention of civil aviation, because the first one was done very fast, a new convention because we accept in principle we should be able to tax aviation fuel. All right, let's have the convention, let's go do it. And that would be an incredible change in launching a golden age of aviation. So that's what I ask people to do. Now, if we could do that, if this vision of a greener, low-carbon aviation was possible, accepting this disruption in the short term, who would support that? Who would think we should do that? Who would support it? Would anybody object to that? Would anyone somehow perhaps feel it? Yeah? No? No, not at all. We should do it then. And that's my final sort of message of having done the analysis. So thank you very much indeed.